to sit in the shade on a fine day and look upon verdure is the most perfect refreshment, writes Jane Austen in Mansfield Park. Welcome to the Jane Austen Society of North America, North Carolina region's April outing to J.C. Raulston Arboretum. We have a delightful program for you today about Austen and nature as we take in the beauties of spring and the glories of Austen's prose. Lord Osborne near Emma and the convenient Mr. Musgrave in high spirits at his own importance on the other side of the fireplace with Elizabeth. He was at no loss for words, but when Lord Osborne had hoped that Emma had not caught cold at the ball, he had nothing more to say for some time and could only gratify his eye by occasional glances at his fair neighbor. Emma was not inclined to give herself much trouble for his entertainment, and after hard labor of mind, he produced the remark of its being a very fine day and followed it up with the question of, "Have you been walking this morning?" "No, my lord, we thought it too dirty." "You should wear half boots." After another pause, "Nothing sets off a neat ankle more than a half boot. Nankeen galoshed with black looks very well. Do not you like half boots?" "Well, yes, but unless they are so stout as to injure their beauty, they are not fit for country walking." "Ladies should ride in dirty weather." "Do you ride?" "No, my lord. No, my lord. I wonder every lady does not. A woman never looks better than on horseback." "But every woman may not have the inclination or the means. If they knew how much it became them, they would all have the inclination. And I fancy, Miss Watson, when once they had the inclination, the means would soon follow." Your lordship thinks we always have our own way. That is a point on which ladies and gentlemen have long disagreed. But without pretending to decide it, I may say that there are some circumstances which even women cannot control. Female economy will do a great deal, my lord, but it cannot turn a small income into a large one. Lord Osborne was silenced.
Catherine has a fine, shady bower, the work of her own infantine labors, assisted by those of two young companions who had resided in the same village. To this bower, which terminated in a very pleasant and retired walk in her aunt's garden, she always wandered whenever anything disturbed her, and it possessed such a charm over her senses as constantly to tranquilize her mind and quiet her spirits. Solitude and reflection might perhaps have had the same effect in her bedchamber. Yet, habit had so strengthened the idea which a fancy had first suggested that such a thought never occurred to Kitty, who was firmly persuaded that her bower alone could restore her to herself. He asks the landlady if there's a house he can rent. She replies, "Alas, sir, there is none. Every house in this village, from the sweetness of the situation and the purity of the air, in which neither misery, ill health, or vice are ever wafted, is inhabited. However," she says, "one family is generous, and so they might be able to vacate it just to please him." This is what he sees as he enters their land. It was in the exact center of a small circular paddock, which was enclosed by a regular paling and bordered with a plantation of Lombardy poplars and spruce firs alternately placed in 3 rows. A gravel walk ran through this beautiful shrubbery, and as the remainder of the paddock was unencumbered with any other timber, the surface of it perfectly even and smooth, and grazed by 4 white cows which were disposed at equal distances from each other. The whole appearance of the place was uncommonly striking.
"And whose very snug-looking place is this?" said Charlotte, as in a sheltered dip within 2 miles of the sea, they passed close by a moderate-sized house, well fenced and planted, and rich in the garden, orchard, and meadows, which are the best embellishments of such a dwelling. "It seems to have as many comforts about it as Willingdon." "Ah," said Mr. Parker, "this is my old house, the house of my forefathers, the house where I and all my brothers and sisters were born and bred, and where my own 3 eldest children were born, where Mrs. Parker and I lived till within the last 2 years, till our new house was finished. I'm glad you are pleased with it. It is an honest old place, and Hillier keeps it in very good order. I have given it up, you know, to the man who occupies the chief of my land. He gets a better house by it, and I a rather better situation. One other hill brings us to Sanditon, modern Sanditon, a beautiful spot. Our ancestors, you know, always built in a hole. Here were we pent down in this little contracted nook, without air or view, only 1 mile and 3/4 from the noblest expanse of ocean between the South Foreland and Land's End, and without the smallest advantage from it. You will not think I have made a bad exchange when we reach Trafalgar House, which, by the by, I almost wish I had not named Trafalgar, for Waterloo is more the thing right now. However, Waterloo is in reserve, and if we have encouragement enough this year for a little crescent to be ventured on, as I trust we shall, then we shall be able to call it Waterloo Crescent, and the name joined to the form of the building, which always takes, will give us the command of lodgers. In a good season, we should have more applications than we could attend to." "It was always a very comfortable house," said Mrs. Parker, looking at it through the back window with something like fondness of regret. "Such a nice garden, such an excellent garden. Yes, my love, but that we may be said to carry it with us. It supplies us, as before, with all the fruit and vegetables we want, and we have in fact all the comfort of an excellent kitchen garden without the constant eyesore of its formalities or the yearly nuisance of its decaying vegetation. Who can endure a cabbage bed in October?" "Oh dear, yes, we are quite as well off for garden stuff as we ever were, for if it is forgot to be brought at any time, we can always buy what we want at Sanditon House. The gardener there is glad enough to supply us, but it was a nice place for the children to run about in, so shady in summer."
The room in question was of a commodious, well-proportioned size, and handsomely fitted up as a dining parlor. And on their quitting it to walk around the grounds, she was shown first into a smaller apartment belonging peculiarly to the master of the house, and made unusually tidy on the occasion, and afterwards into what was to be the drawing room, with the appearance of which, though unfurnished, Catherine was delighted enough even to satisfy the general. It was a prettily shaped room, the windows reaching to the ground, and the view from them pleasant, though only over green meadows, and she expressed her admiration at the moment with all the honest simplicity with which she felt it. "Oh, why do you not fit up this room, Mr. Tilney? What a pity not to have it fitted up. It is the prettiest room I ever saw. It is the prettiest room in the world." "I trust," said the general with a most satisfied smile, "that it will very speedily be furnished. It waits only for a lady's taste." "Well, if it was my house, I should never sit anywhere else. Oh, what a sweet little cottage there is among the trees. Apple trees, too. It is the prettiest cottage. You like it, you approve of it as an object. It is enough. Henry, remember that Robinson has spoken to about it. The cottage remains." Such a compliment recalled all Catherine's consciousness and silenced her directly, and though pointedly applied to by the general for her choice of the prevailing color of the paper and hangings, nothing like an opinion on the subject could be drawn from her. The influence of fresh objects and fresh air, however, was of great use in dissipating these embarrassing associations, and having reached the ornamental part of the premises, consisting of a walk round 2 sides of a meadow, on which Henry's genius had begun to act about half a year ago, she was sufficiently recovered to think it prettier than any pleasure ground she had ever been in before, though there was not a shrub in it higher than the green bench in the corner. A saunter into other meadows and through part of the village, with a visit to the stables to examine some improvements, and a charming game of play with a litter of puppies just able to roll about, brought them to 4 o'clock, when Catherine scarcely thought it could be 3. At 4 they were to dine, and at 6 to set off on their return. Never had any day passed so quickly.
Indeed, she had no taste for a garden, and if she gathered flowers at all, it was chiefly for the pleasure of mischief. She was, moreover, noisy and wild, hated confinement and cleanliness, and loved nothing so well in the world as rolling down the green slope at the back of the house. From Volume 2, Chapter 7, In the Garden at Northanger. She was struck, however, beyond her expectation by the grandeur of the abbey as she saw it for the first time from the lawn. The whole building enclosed a large court, and 2 sides of the quadrangle, rich in Gothic ornaments, stood forward for admiration. The remainder was shut off by knolls of old trees or luxuriant plantations, and the steep woody hills rising behind to give it shelter were beautiful even in the leafless month of March. Catherine had seen nothing to compare with it, and her feelings of delight were so strong that without waiting for any better authority, she boldly burst forth in wonder and praise. The general listened with assenting gratitude, and it seemed as if his own estimation of Northanger had waited unfixed till that hour. The kitchen garden was next to be admired, and he led the way to it across a small portion of the park. The number of acres contained in this garden was such as Catherine could not listen to without dismay, being more than double the extent of all of Mr. Allen's, as well as her father's, including churchyard and orchard. The walls seemed countless in number, endless in length. A village of hothouses seemed to arise among them, and a whole parish to be at work within the enclosure. The general was flattered by her looks of surprise, which told him almost as plainly as he soon forced her to tell him in words that she had never seen any gardens at all equal to them before. And then he modestly owned that, without any ambition that sort himself, without any solicitude about it, he did believe them to be unrivaled in the kingdom. If he had a hobby horse, it was that. He loved a garden. Though careless enough in most matters of eating, he loved good fruit, or if he did not, his friends and children did. There were great vexations, however, attending such a garden as his. The utmost care could not always secure the most valuable fruits. The pinery had yielded only 100 in the last year. Mr. Allen, he supposed, must feel these inconveniences as well as himself. No, not at all. Mr. Allen did not care about the garden and never went into it. With a triumphant smile of self-satisfaction, the general wished he could do the same, for he never entered his without being vexed in some way or other by its falling short of his plan. How were Mr. Allen's succession houses worked? Describing the nature of his own as they entered them. Mr. Allen had only one small hothouse, which Mrs. Allen had the use of for her plants in winter, and there was a fire in it now and then. "He is a happy man," said the general with a look of very happy contempt.
"And how does dear, dear Norland look?" cried Mary Ann. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor, "probably looks much as it always does this time of the year. The woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Mary Ann, "with what transporting sensation have I formerly seen them fall! How have I delighted, as I walked, to see them driven in showers about me by the wind! What feelings have they, the season, the air, altogether inspired! Now there is no one to regard them. They are seen only as a nuisance, swept hastily off, and driven as much as possible from sight. "It is not everyone," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves." "No, my feelings are not often shared, not often understood, but sometimes they are."
Here are a few passages from letters relating to Jane Austen and nature. In 1811, she wrote to Cassandra saying, "I will not say your mulberry trees are dead, but I am afraid they are not alive." In a letter from 1814 on a visit to Hans Place, "I live in his room downstairs. It is particularly pleasant from opening upon the garden. I go and refresh myself every now and then come back to solitary coolness." And from Austen's nephew, his memoir, James Edward Austen Lee vividly describes the first landscape she knew, the area encompassing Steventon Village and Church, Hampshire. His aunt's infusion of southern England into her novels was apparent to him even as a teen. And he wrote, "This was the cradle of her genius. These were the first objects which inspired her young heart with a sense of the beauties of nature. In strolls along those wood walks, thick-coming fancies rose in her mind and gradually assumed the forms in which they came forth to the world." The end. Thank you.
Before they were separated by the conclusion of the play, she had the unexpected happiness of an invitation to accompany her uncle and aunt in a tour of pleasure which they proposed taking in the summer. "We have not determined how far it shall carry us," said Mrs. Gardiner, "but perhaps to the lakes." No scheme could have been more agreeable to Elizabeth, and her acceptance of the invitation was most ready and grateful. "Oh, my dear, dear aunt," she rapturously cried, "what delight, what felicity! You give me fresh life and vigor. Adieu to disappointment and spleen. What are young men to rocks and mountains? Oh, what hours of transport we shall spend, and when we do return, it shall not be like other travelers without being able to give one accurate idea of anything. We will know where we have gone. We will recollect what we have seen. Lakes, mountains, and rivers shall not be jumbled together in our imaginations. Nor will, when we attempt to describe any particular scene, will we begin quarreling about its relative situation. Let our first effusions be less insupportable than those of the generality of travelers."
They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds. When, in spots where the opening of trees gave the eye power to wander, were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hills, with the long range of woods overspreading many, and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile, they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time, in a descent among hanging woods to the edge of the water in one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge in character with the general air of the scene. It was a spot less adorned than any they had yet visited, and the valley, here contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppice-wood which bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no farther. and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was therefore obliged to submit, and they took their way toward the house on the opposite side of the river in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water, and talking to the man about them, that he advanced but little. While wandering on this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance, she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and to imitate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place, but she had not got beyond the words delightful and charming when some unlucky recollection obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Her color changed, and she said no more.
It was hot, and after walking some time over the gardens in a scattered, dispersed way, scarcely any three together, they insensibly followed one another to the delicious shade of a broad, short avenue of limes, which, stretching beyond the garden and an equal distance from the river, seemed the finish of the pleasure grounds. Led to nothing but a view at the end over a low stone wall with high pillars, which seemed intended in their erection to give the appearance of an approach to the house, which never had been there. Disputable, however, as might be the taste of such a termination, it was in itself a charming walk, and the view which closed it extremely pretty. The considerable slope at nearly the foot of which the abbey stood gradually acquired a steeper form beyond its grounds, and at half a mile distance was a bank of considerable abruptness and grandeur, well clothed with wood, and at the bottom of this bank, favorably placed and sheltered, rose the Abbey Mill Farm, with meadows in front, and the river making a close and handsome curve around it. It was a sweet view, sweet to the eye and the mind. English verdure, English culture, English comfort, seen under a sun bright without being oppressive. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you've enjoyed this time in nature and this time with Austen. We'll see you at our next meeting of JASNA-NC.